They said the Queen of Hollywood was difficult. They said she was unreliable. But on this one day, October 8th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe wasn't difficult. She was simply broken, and her trembling hand proved the myth was about to end in front of the entire studio. She stood alone in the brilliant, blinding wash of the studio lights, a diamond in the spotlight, but one that felt as if it were about to shatter. This was Hollywood in 1962, and the set was less a creative space and more a cage built of expectations and cold steel. The air felt heavy with the silence of 40 waiting crew members, all watching the star, the legend, the mythical creation who could not seem to take her next breath, let alone her next line. They didn't see Norma Jean Mortensen, the anxious, vulnerable girl who just wanted to feel safe. They saw $1 million liability, a delayed schedule, and the ticking clock of a studio losing patience. She was exhausted, drained by the constant performance, and today something essential was missing. The light in her eyes, that famous, mesmerizing spark that could launch 1,000 ships and end 1,000 marriages, was gone. It was replaced by a weariness that went bone deep. She was dressed in a gown of shimmering, impractical silk, perfectly cinched at the waist, perfectly tailored to the fantasy. But beneath the layers of chiffon and meticulously applied makeup, the soul of the woman was threadbare. For weeks, the pressure had been unbearable. "Monroe, we need to hear you," Director Charles called out, the edge of his voice sharper this time, a knife slicing through the silence. She was slated to film the climactic scene of the day, a moment requiring a specific, wrenching kind of emotional honesty. She had practiced the lines endlessly, but when the camera was rolling for the 4th time, the words felt like lead on her tongue. It felt like asking her to perform open-heart surgery on herself, under the scrutiny of floodlights. Every late arrival, every missed mark was amplified, and the pressure settled on her shoulders. Heavier than her mink stole. She tried again. Her lips parted, the air rushed out, and what came out was a small, ragged gasp, not the powerful, tearful monologue required. She bowed her head, the perfectly styled platinum curls hiding the sudden flush of shame on her cheeks. The director screamed, "Action!" But Marilyn was frozen, her gaze fixed on a point just above the camera lens, as if searching for an escape hatch that wasn't there. This wasn't just another bad day on set. This was the moment the beautiful, fragile machine that was the world's biggest icon finally jammed. Her required line was simple, a single declaration of deep, abiding vulnerability, yet the words seemed stuck behind a lump in her throat, a physical manifestation of all the sorrow she carried. This was the 5th attempt at the scene, and with each failure, the collective breath of the crew grew shorter, heavier, and colder. The cinematographer, usually a man of booming confidence, now held his breath, praying through his viewfinder. The script supervisor chewed her pencil down to the lead. Every delay cost the studio thousands upon thousands of dollars, and that financial pressure was a palpable weight settling on Marilyn's shoulders. She knew the script, knew the blocking, and knew the moment was meant to be the emotional centerpiece of the entire film. But the feeling needed to fuel that performance was too close to her own reality. "Cut! For the love of God, cut! What is happening, Marilyn? It's 2 lines. Find the feeling. We are done wasting time." The director's accusation hung in the air like poison. Marilyn felt the familiar burn behind her eyes, the one that signaled the total surrender of Norma Jean. She took one last desperate look toward the shadowy rear entrance of the soundstage, searching for a face, a place, anything that represented stability and home, knowing she would find nothing but concrete and locked doors. The pressure became too much to bear. She closed her eyes, the tears finally escaping, and she knew she couldn't give them a 6th take. She was collapsing right there in the center of her own fragile public kingdom. She opened her mouth not to speak the line, but perhaps to finally admit defeat, to apologize, to simply beg for a moment of quiet peace. But before a sound could escape, a movement caught her eye, a flash of dark fabric near the stage exit, a presence that simply didn't belong in this frantic circus. Would you like to subscribe to hear more untold stories about Hollywood's human moments? Hit that subscribe button now to follow the journey of this single moment that would alter Marilyn's life forever. The yelling stopped, the pressure vanished, because suddenly, the king of the baseball diamond walked onto the Hollywood soundstage, a figure of solid, quiet steel in a world made of glitter and smoke. Joe DiMaggio had arrived, and the entire crew knew they were about to witness a war between fame and the heart. A ripple of confusion started not near the blinding lights, but near the back exit, signaling the arrival of a presence that was magnetic yet utterly unwilling to be noticed. Standing there, framed in the dusty doorway like a man who had intentionally walked off a black and white movie poster, was Joe DiMaggio. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that seemed to absorb the frantic Hollywood light, radiating an aura of unwavering stability that stood in stark contrast to the set's organized hysteria. In a world defined by artifice and flamboyant gestures, Joe was real steel, solid, silent, and dignified. He didn't stride in. He simply entered, and the sheer gravitational pull of his presence commanded immediate, unforced respect. The crew was stunned. DiMaggio had deliberately kept his distance from Hollywood for years, protecting his privacy and, perhaps more importantly, protecting the memory of his shared time with Marilyn. To see him here, in this chaotic, exposed moment, was like watching a ghost walk onto a brightly lit stage. He didn't acknowledge the cameras or the famous director. His gaze was narrow, focused, and fixed solely on the small, trembling figure near the camera mark. Marilyn, her face still wet with unshed tears, felt the temperature in the room shift. She followed the sudden, collective focus of the crew's eyes. When her vision cleared and landed on the man in the shadows, the effect was immediate and profound. It wasn't the shock of seeing an ex-husband. It was the shock of seeing her only true home walk back into the tempest. The sight of him didn't trigger anger or regret or any of the complicated emotions tied to their public relationship. It triggered a single overwhelming feeling: vulnerability. It was the vulnerability of Norma Jean, the little girl who finally saw the one person who she believed accepted her completely, flaws and all. The wall she had struggled to maintain suddenly collapsed. They hadn't been friends, not truly in the traditional sense, but they had been anchors to each other's reality. She took a clumsy step backwards, her hand instinctively reaching toward her mouth, not to quiet a gasp, but to stifle a sob. Joe DiMaggio, the man known for his stoicism, took a slow, deliberate step forward, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. He wasn't there as a spectator or a celebrity guest. He was there as her silent guardian, arriving at the exact catastrophic moment when she needed shielding the most. The fragile composure Marilyn had been fighting for 5 long takes completely dissolved, paving the way for the raw, public collapse that the crew was utterly unprepared to witness. For a single devastating moment, the brilliant, blinding light of Hollywood vanished, and she was simply Norma Jean, standing across a room from the only man who truly saw her, not the icon. It was the end of the line, the final, terrifying realization that the mask she had worn for a decade had just disintegrated. The entire crew watched in horrified silence as the world's most glamorous star went from a pillar of silk and platinum into a shuddering, broken figure. She didn't collapse with a dramatic flair or a theatrical sob. Her breakdown was one of pure physical defeat. Her knees buckled without warning, and she sank to the cold cement floor of the soundstage, her silk gown pooling around her like discarded liquid. Her hands flew up, not to wipe away the tears, but to shield her face entirely, desperate to hide the raw, ugly truth of her sorrow from the 40 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. The sounds that escaped her were not the controlled crying of a movie scene, but the ragged, helpless gasps of someone who has finally run out of energy to fight. It was a complete surrender. The chaos that followed was a producer's nightmare and a director's panic attack. The director, Charles, yelled, "Cut! Cut the cameras!" But the command was muffled and useless, lost in the echoing expanse of the stage. The cameras weren't rolling for the scene, but the moment was so sensational, so utterly unscripted that for a second, no one could move. The lighting crew stood frozen on the catwalks. The sound man yanked his headphones off. Every person in the room realized they were watching something they were never meant to see, the complete public annihilation of the Marilyn Monroe myth. The noise of the breakdown itself was terrifying, the sheer, unchecked volume of a woman weeping without restraint. Then the center of gravity shifted. Joe DiMaggio, who had remained silent in the shadows, moved. He didn't rush or express shock. He moved with the steady, purposeful grace of a legendary athlete focused only on the mission. He strode directly past the frantic director and the frozen crew, his suit a solid wall of calm separating her from the lights. He didn't kneel immediately. Instead, he simply stood guard over her small, trembling body, his back to the cameras, his presence creating an immediate, impenetrable shield of privacy. He spoke to the closest producer without even turning around, his voice low but carrying the immutable authority of a man who dealt in certainties, not fleeting Hollywood fantasy. "Clear the stage," he commanded. "Now, she needs 10 minutes. His eyes, usually cool and guarded, held a fierce protective fire, daring anyone to challenge his authority. In that singular moment, Joe DiMaggio wasn't the ex-husband. He was the guardian of her spirit, willing to tear down the entire set just to give Norma Jean room to breathe. The sight of him, solid and unwavering, shielding the crumpled icon, amplified the heartbreak of the scene tenfold. If you've ever felt completely alone in a crowd, only to be saved by one person's unwavering support, drop a comment below and share your story. Sometimes all the fame in the world can't replace one loyal heart. Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, wasn't used to losing, and in that tense, suffocating moment, he was not about to lose this silent battle for her peace. He wasn't yelling or demanding. His authority was simply inherent, radiating outward like a force field that pushed the frantic Hollywood crew back. Every single person on that soundstage knew that whatever Joe wanted, he would get. His control was absolute because it was quiet. He didn't need to touch her to command the room. He simply stood, a dark silhouette against the overwhelming lights, protecting the crumpled figure beneath him. When the flustered director Charles tried to argue, Joe cut him off with 2 words that contained the finality of a court ruling. "It's over." He glanced at the camera operators who quickly lowered their equipment, suddenly ashamed to be witnessing such private anguish. The grip boys started clearing the set not because they were ordered by the producer, but because they respected the code of the legendary standing guard. Joe bent down slightly, offering his hand but not demanding she take it. It was a gesture of respect for her agency, even in her despair. Marilyn, still sobbing but now shielded from the harshest glare, looked up at him through tear-streaked eyes. For the first time all week, she didn't see an interviewer, a photographer, or a judge. She saw a haven. She grasped his hand not for balance, but for the profound sense of stability it represented. He pulled her gently to her feet. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He simply ushered her away from the center of the stage. He guided her past the gaping crew, past the red velvet ropes, and into the cramped, overheated privacy of her dressing room trailer. It was a 10-foot walk, but it felt like 1,000 miles away from the world. Inside the small trailer, the contrast was staggering. Outside, there were millions of eyes and thousands of kilowatts of light. Inside, there was just the hum of the air conditioning unit and the heavy silence between them. The moment the door clicked shut, sealing them off from the Hollywood nightmare, Marilyn's knees buckled again. She didn't fall this time. She sank onto the small, plush velvet sofa. Joe stood facing the door, effectively blocking the world out. She pulled her knees to her chest, her famous face buried in the silk of her skirt, trembling. Joe knew that what she needed most was not fixing, but space. He didn't approach her, didn't offer a blanket, and didn't utter any empty reassurances. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a small, almost insignificant rectangle of paper, worn at the edges and slightly discolored as if it had been carried for months or even years, a silent, physical symbol of a promise he never broke. He placed it silently on the small vanity table next to her, never breaking his gaze from the door. It wasn't advice, or a sermon, or a desperate plea. It was just a tiny faded piece of paper, and it was heavier than any contract she had ever signed. He then turned to her, his gaze finally soft but firm. "It's there," he whispered, his deep voice rough. "Read it when you're ready." He did not wait for an answer, nor did he press her. He had delivered his offering, a tiny anchor of stability in the middle of her storm, and now he would wait for the words he had carried to do their silent work. Joe didn't offer a speech or a hug. Those were Hollywood gestures, meaningless and temporary. He offered something much heavier than words or affection, a tiny folded piece of paper, a silent weight of history and commitment. It lay on the vanity. A simple white square of stiff index card, stark against the glittering chaos of Marilyn's perfumes and powders. Marilyn's sobs had subsided into deep, shuddering breaths. She watched the paper, unable to look away, yet terrified to touch it. It was so small, so ordinary, yet it seemed to radiate the kind of steadfastness that had been missing from her life for years. This scrap of paper wasn't a studio note or a public apology. It was Joe's presence distilled into a private talisman. She slowly reached for it, her fingers still shaking from the public anguish. Her mind, usually racing with 1,000 anxieties, was suddenly focused only on this item. She recognized the faint, familiar scent of pipe tobacco and clean linen clinging to the card, Joe's specific, unchanging aroma that brought back memories of their quiet home in San Francisco, far away from the flashing bulbs of Los Angeles. This was a piece of his world, solid and reliable, placed deliberately into her fractured reality. She unfolded the card with excruciating slowness, as if the paper itself were fragile and might tear. The index card had been kept in his jacket pocket, meaning he had carried it with him, intending this delivery long before he arrived on the soundstage. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to her collapse. This was a pre-planned intervention, a protective measure from a man who knew her soul better than anyone. The lighting in the small trailer was harsh, revealing the simple, black typewritten words on the crisp white paper. Marilyn leaned closer, her breath hitching one last time as she prepared to read. Was it a legal document, a warning, a request? She had faced demands from every direction for the last decade, but this felt different. This felt like a gift. She knew the entire story hinged on this fragile piece of cardstock. The cameras had been shut down, the crew had been cleared, and the icon had been shielded, all for the purpose of her absorbing the power contained within these few, carefully chosen letters. The world outside the trailer was silent, the soundstage waiting, the entire machinery of Hollywood halted for a woman to read 12 words. She looked up at Joe, who stood sentinel by the door, his gaze unmoving. He offered no prompting, no encouragement, just the quiet, resolute strength of his presence. He wasn't giving her direction. He was simply giving her permission to choose peace. She lowered her eyes once more to the card, ready to take in the declaration that would either shatter her further or begin the long, agonizing process of rebuilding. This is the most protected secret in Hollywood history. Now that we know the setting and the players, are you ready to learn the 12 words that changed everything? Share this story with a friend who needs to remember that true love sees past the facade. Marilyn's eyes scanned the words once, and in that devastating instant, the internal storm that had been raging inside her for months, the one threatening to tear her apart, vanished. It wasn't a miracle cure for her pain, but an anchor dropped into the deepest part of her soul. She read the 12 words again, slowly, letting the meaning sink in, finding every bit of strength and quiet assurance they contained. The declaration, typed simply onto the index card he had carried, read, "It's just the two of us now. Come home, kid. I'm waiting." 12 simple words. They contained no demands, no recriminations, and no judgment of her current failure. They were the opposite of everything Hollywood represented. Hollywood saw a star, a brand, a problem to be solved with money and lighting. Joe saw Kid, a private nickname from their earliest, least complicated days together. A nickname that bypassed the facade of Marilyn Monroe and went straight to the heart of Norma Jean. The phrase, "It's just the two of us now," was a code. It was a throwback to the brief, glorious period when they had been married, when they shared a small, ordinary home, and when he had tried desperately to protect her from the fame that was consuming her. It meant, I don't care about the cameras, the contracts, the headlines, or the public perception. All that matters is your safety and your peace. Tears, fresh and clean, finally rolled down her cheeks, but these were different. They were the tears of release, the letting go of 3 years of relentless effort to uphold an impossible image. She hadn't realized how deeply she had feared that she had pushed away the only man who still offered her sanctuary. By offering this quiet, written invitation, Joe had reaffirmed his promise to protect Norma Jean from the world's fury. This profound realization that she had a genuine, unshakable ally was the single greatest gift he could have ever offered her in that moment of complete public despair. She looked at the card again, noting the slight smudge from where it must have rubbed against his suit lining. It was physical proof that he had kept her close, even in their separation. The final, simple phrase, "I'm waiting," was the most powerful of all. It suggested stability, a lighthouse in the fog. He wasn't demanding she come immediately or change who she was. He simply made it known that her escape route was always open, guaranteed, and ready. Marilyn took a long, shaky breath, the first truly deep breath she'd taken all day. The tension began to drain from her shoulders, melting away the stress that had bound her like steel wire. She folded the card carefully, slipping it into the deep, hidden pocket of her silk gown. The emotional damage wasn't fixed, but the immediate panic had subsided, replaced by a profound, life-altering sense of being seen and cherished. Joe hadn't given her a pep talk. He had given her a home. She slowly lifted her head and looked at Joe, who still stood by the door, and offered him a silent, tiny nod. The crisis had passed, and now the professional could return. The director and the crew were still waiting outside the trailer, wondering if the day was lost, if the whole production would collapse under the weight of their star's instability. They didn't know that the fragile icon they needed was already gone, replaced by a woman who had just rediscovered her anchor. She stood up, smoothing the silk of her dress, ready to show the waiting world the immense, powerful strength that came not from fame, but from a private, protective love. When Marilyn emerged, she didn't look rested or even apologetic. She looked reborn, like the star who could conquer any challenge, freshly armed with a secret strength. She stepped out of that trailer and back onto the soundstage, leaving the fragility of Norma Jean locked behind the velvet door. The crew, expecting more tears or a delay, recoiled slightly, astonished by the quiet, fierce dignity radiating from her. Director Charles, still sweating and pacing, tried to approach her with a cautious, prepared speech about time and budgets. She walked right past him, stopping exactly on her mark. Her chin was up, her eyes clear, and she simply said, in a voice that cut through the remaining tension like glass, "Reset the scene, please. I'm ready for the take." She didn't ask, she commanded. It was the voice of the professional. The legend, the mythical creation who had momentarily vanished, now returned with a devastating focus. The crew scrambled to obey, energized by the unexpected shift in atmosphere. The massive camera rolled back into place, the lights warmed up again, and the clapboard snapped. As the director called action for the 6th time, the difference was immediate and palpable. Where before there had been hesitation, now there was a seamless flow of emotion. Marilyn's entire body softened, allowing the vulnerability that had caused her breakdown moments earlier to now be channeled into the performance. She didn't have to reach for the character's pain. She had just lived it. The monologue she delivered was not simply acted, it was inhabited. Her voice was rich, resonant, and thick with the genuine, hard-won sorrow of her life. Every gesture, every look into the lens was flawless. It was a kind of transcendent, mesmerizing work that reminded every cynic on that set why she was the highest paid star in the world. She delivered the final climactic line, the one that had choked her for 5 takes, with heartbreaking precision, concluding the scene on a single crystalline tear that tracked a path down her cheek, stopping perfectly before it hit the neckline of her gown. When the director finally whispered, "Cut, print it," his voice was hoarse with shock and satisfaction. He hadn't just gotten the shot, he had witnessed a creative miracle, a complete instantaneous recovery, engineered not by his direction, but by some unseen force. The entire crew burst into applause, a spontaneous, genuine ovation. Not the polite applause given to a celebrity, but the respect given to a master artist. Marilyn stood on her mark for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. She offered a small, knowing smile, the perfect Hollywood gesture of thanks. As the lights began to change for the next shot, she glanced discreetly toward the rear exit, the spot where Joe DiMaggio had stood sentinel. He was gone. He hadn't lingered for the applause, the congratulations, or the glory. His mission had been accomplished. He had delivered his 12 words, and the power of that secret love had allowed the star to rise again. The only sign he had been there was the slight, unconscious pressure of Marilyn's hand pressed against the pocket of her gown, guarding the folded card, the invisible, private talisman that now held more power than any studio contract. Joe DiMaggio was gone, a phantom of strength and stability, but the note remained, a silent guarantee clutched tight in Marilyn's hand. He hadn't waited for the triumphant applause or the director's grateful handshake. His work was not about public validation, but about private salvation. The stage was now hers, fully restored, but the true miracle had occurred just feet away, locked inside the trailer. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of nervous energy disguised as efficiency. Director Charles, his face pale with relief, demanded immediate preparation for the next scene, terrified that the fragile state might return. He shot nervous glances at Marilyn, trying to decipher the secret source of her sudden composure. The crew whispered, their hushed tones focusing entirely on Joe's sudden dramatic appearance and his equally silent departure. They knew something profound had occurred, something that had stopped the production's collapse, but they couldn't name it. Marilyn, however, was serene. She sat calmly while Whitey touched up her makeup, her famous eyes distant but focused. When the producer cautiously asked her what Joe had said, she simply offered a radiant, impenetrable smile, the very picture of the evasive star. "Oh, just told me to remember my lines, darling," she purred, dismissing the question with a wave of her hand. It was the perfect Hollywood lie, smooth and believable, ensuring the secret remained hers. Alone, she folded the index card again, slipping it not back into her pocket, but into the hidden depths of her brassiere, closer to her heart than any diamond or contract could ever be. It was now a private talisman, a sacred relic of a love that saw through the dazzling, temporary facade of fame to the scared, exhausted woman underneath. The industry demanded that she be Marilyn Monroe, the impossible fantasy, but Joe's 12 words gave her the permission to be Norma Jean whenever she needed. That day, the atmosphere around her shifted permanently. The crew noticed a change. She was still demanding yes, but her eyes held a new, quiet resilience. When the pressure mounted, they would see her hand drift unconsciously toward the center of her chest, touching the small, square fold of paper. It was her invisible shield, a constant physical reminder that she had an escape route, an advocate, and a man whose simple promise was stronger than the entire studio system. The knowledge that the most powerful man in baseball would drop everything, defy every public expectation, and simply stand guard over her brokenness was the ultimate act of devotion. It was a victory not for her career, but for her soul. Hollywood only wanted her light. Joe offered her a safe place in the dark. The note was not about reconciliation or marriage. It was about unconditional stability. It was the single, private truth that allowed her to navigate the sensationalism of her life with a shred of inner peace, a peace that nobody else could see or touch, a secret weapon carried in silk. The cameras may have missed the moment, the director may have forgotten the words, but Joe DiMaggio's private note left a permanent, quiet mark on the rest of her story. It wasn't the final headline of her life, but it was the quiet, hidden source of strength she carried until the very end. The power of that silent 12-word promise only truly became clear long after the lights had gone out on The Star for good. Hollywood never knew the truth of her recovery that day. They saw the flawless take, attributed it to professional discipline, and moved on. But Marilyn knew. The note became her secret keeper, her talisman against the chaos. In the subsequent years, through the relentless demands and the suffocating pressure of her fame, she never let it out of her sight. It was not framed or displayed. It was far too sacred for that. It was kept folded and tucked into the most personal, protected places, sometimes deep inside a satin jewelry box, sometimes hidden beneath the lining of a favorite evening bag. It was her constant reminder that an escape route, a safe place called home, was guaranteed. When Marilyn Monroe ceased living in 1962, the world erupted in a sensational storm of speculation and sadness. But far away from the flashing bulbs and the intrusive questions, there was Joe DiMaggio, the only person who understood the full depth of her struggle. Joe was the one who claimed her body and arranged the funeral, keeping the entire circus of fame at bay, demanding that the public and the paparazzi respect the private dignity of Norma Jean Mortensen one last sacred time. He protected her memory just as he had protected her soul on that chaotic soundstage. It wasn't until her belongings were quietly, carefully inventoried that the true legacy of that soundstage moment was revealed. Tucked deep inside a worn, personal, leather-bound Bible, a book she rarely showed anyone, was a small, familiar rectangle of faded index card. It was Joe's writing, neat and simple, having survived the years, the moisture, and the relentless turmoil of her life. When the words were finally read again by those closest to her, they carried the weight of a powerful, private vow. It wasn't a love letter in the romantic sense. It was a testament to unconditional shelter. The words had never changed. "It's just the two of us now. Come home, kid. I'm waiting." It confirmed that Joe's love was not for the star, but for the soul struggling beneath the spotlight. This final, silent piece of evidence showed the world that even at the height of her isolation, she had held on to the single, most important truth. She mattered to someone not for her beauty or her fame, but simply for being herself. Joe DiMaggio had given her 12 words that offered a sanctuary, a promise of stability stronger than the entire unstable kingdom of Hollywood. That was the most extraordinary secret they ever shared, a 12-word code for a home she could always return to, a love that saw her weakness and offered protection, not judgment. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio is often told through screaming headlines and public scandal, but their enduring love was written on a simple index card. If this powerful secret touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button to join our family and like the video to help us share these human moments behind the legends.